Should be able to.
Well, you don't see it now. My video's on.
He'll be on, okay.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our third in a series of rabbis on rotation. It's our pleasure to have Rabbi David Jacobowitz as our speaker. Just want to share a quick introduction and let him continue. It happens that during the 60s, the Rav gave a number of lectures at Mizrahi religious Zionist conventions. And as part of those lectures, one of them in particular was dealing with the topic of wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. And in that particular lecture, he cited a number of principles that he felt was important in his view of not only Mizrahi, but I think Orthodoxy in general. And I just want to share one of those as a lead-in to David's 3 sessions. Rav wrote, "I believe with perfect heart that this Torah is given to be observed, realized, and fully carried out in every place and at all times, within every social, economic, and cultural framework, in every technological circumstance, and every political condition." I like to think that the words of the Rav have come true, especially in our day, and I'm sure that Rabbi Jacobowitz will share with us important insights in regard to this idea and many others as he addresses us on modern Orthodoxy, past, present, and future. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Green. Appreciate it very much. So first, just some ground rules. I'm going to set the participant option here of everybody being muted for now and go through the lecture and leave ample time at the end for questions. What I'd like to ask you to do is use the chat function at any point during the lecture. And then we'll look at all those questions and try to answer them as a group afterwards. It just feels like it'll be more efficient that way. Hopefully that's okay with everybody. So our plan here is to spend 3 weeks going through the topic of modern Orthodoxy, past, present, and future. So in part 1, we're going to be talking about the transformation from traditional Judaism, which is what any of the Rishonim or the Tanaim or Amoraim would have related to. How did that transfer into modern Orthodoxy? What is it? What were the causes that made that happen? And in part 2, we'll focus in on the 20th century and the rise of American modern Orthodoxy. And finally, in part 3, we'll talk about perhaps the most interesting part, which is what is the view for the future? What are the demographic projections? And in particular, what are the major challenges that face the modern Orthodox community? How are we going to overcome those challenges? How are we going to approach them? So let's start with the term Orthodox. In a way, when you think about it, it's kind of a strange term. What does this have to do with Judaism? And in fact, it was derived from Christian usage, and it referred to those who, I'm reading the definition, held fast to the tenets and dogmas of their church. And in the case of Judaism, it refers to generally accepted traditional teachings that are current in Jewish society and the people who adhere to them. So it was the philosophy or the theology, and over time it started referring to the people who actually practiced that theology. It was first used in a Berlin newspaper in 1795 and has become quite current. Actually, since in Judaism, the observance rather than the belief is the key, you could argue that orthoprax should have been really more correct. of a terminology than Orthodox. In any case, this was the term that became the accepted label. And it's interesting to note that there have been a number of suggested alternatives to the term Orthodox Judaism. Rabbi Rachman suggested authentic Judaism. Rabbi Schwab suggested Sinai Judaism. Rabbi Hirsch suggested original Judaism. And Rabbi Eliezer Berkovitz suggested Mosaic Judaism. So those are just some candidates, but Orthodox Judaism seems to have won out. Now, where did this begin, so to speak? So you think about it, in Europe, and particularly in Western Europe and Central Europe, what was Jewish life like? Jewish life was organized into a kehillah system, and the Vad Ha'arba Ha'aratzot, which ruled, unilaterally across all the areas that they governed. There was a very rigid kehillah system, and if you committed an infraction, you were punished. The rabbis had the ability to actually punish people. There are drawings of Jews being pilloried, being locked up, all sorts of punishments being done, because the kehillah was the key. Along came the Enlightenment. Along came the idea that reason and individualism really triumph over tradition. And in particular, and I'm going to share a screen now. Can you all see? Does everybody see? Yes.
Yes, we can
nod.
see.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So the French Revolution in the last part of the 18th century ushered in personal freedom, equal rights, the ability for free expression of beliefs. Now, for the Jewish community, this was a mixed blessing, created quite a tension, because as we say, the community had its own courts and laws and beliefs, and Jews were caught between the full participation in society versus an adherence to Jewish law in a structured environment. And then further, during Napoleon's time, he brought Enlightenment ideas not only through France, but into Central and Eastern Europe. And with his army and with his conquests, these ideas were brought deeper and deeper into Europe until his defeat in 1813. So as a result of this, what they called the New Dawn, Jews began to really desire to reform Judaism, to make it align with the ideas of the Enlightenment. And they had a couple of focus areas. One was aesthetics. Jews started wanting to build aesthetically pleasing shuls to emulate the high European culture. Well, we've all learned since then what high European culture is capable of, but that's what they thought of. And that weekly sermons should be in the vernacular as opposed to in Yiddish. They were exclusively in Yiddish. And so the first major reform was in synagogue architecture. You see here pictures of typical medieval synagogues. Here, the one on the top is a synagogue, a Czech synagogue. And here we have a synagogue in Krakow in Kazimierz. And they're kind of like, not a lot to look at. What was important is what went on inside. But in Hamburg, the synagogue that was built was called the New Israelite Temple. And the organizers wanted to appeal to acculturated Jews with a modernized ritual. They defied the local rabbinic court that ordered them to stop. And they also published tracts which castigated the entire rabbinical elite as hypocritical and outmoded. So the innovations that they pushed forward in this new temple were prayers in German, a choir. Notice how some of these, by the way, filtered later, obviously, into Orthodox shuls. An organ played by a Gentile. They were very careful about halacha initially. They didn't want to have a Jew playing the organ, so they hired a Gentile. The introduction of bat mitzvah and the elimination of language related to the return to Israel. The use of the word temple, very interesting, I think, was deliberate to refocus away from Shivat Zion and Binyan Beis Hamikdash and Tchiat HaMesim. They wanted to call their shuls temples very deliberately. So by 1820, the reformers had accomplished the following. They moved the pulpit to the front from the middle. They eliminated the mitzitza bapeh in a Brit. They eliminated kitniot on Pesach, the Isser of kitniot. They eliminated Yom Tov Sheni. They eliminated men's head coverings. And they eliminated the recitation of Kol Nidre, which they found offensive, inconsistent and offensive. So most historians feel that this dispute, with its concerted backlash against reform, because the Orthodox Jews, so to speak, as you'll see, reacted very strongly to the Hamburg Temple, that it marks the beginning of Orthodox Judaism. The father of reform, you see depicted here, is a man called Abraham Geiger. His writings and his speeches challenged Torah's narrative, and he stressed the need to reinterpret halacha. He emphasized Judaism's constant development along historical and universalistic traits. He wanted to reformulate Judaism to be compliant with modern times. So in a way, he was the first modern Jew, but not an Orthodox Jew. He was a modern reformer. An example of the change that they did is, take a look at the Mipnei Chatoenu. So on the right side, you have the Mipnei Chatoenu that we all recognize from our Nusach. Look at how they changed it. Mipnei Chatoenu galini mi'artzeinu, nisrachakta mi'alad masenu. So far, so good. V'ein anachnu yicholim lasos chavoseinu beis b'chirasecha v'bayat hagadol v'kadosh v'nikra shemcha olav mipnei hayod hashlucha b'mikdashecha. So far, no problem. Yehi ratzon b'fanecha Hashem Elokeinu k'avoseinu shetikabel barachamim uvratzon areshet tzvatenu b'mekom karbanot chavotenu. You see? Accept our prayers instead of karbonos. To me, them considram misafim kilchatam, uvimkom musfe yom, etc. Kippurim azeh be'ahava kamitzvah ritzonecha. So very subtle overshadowing of the karbonot by tefillah. Now on this, it's fascinating to think the Rambam and Moreh Nevuchim actually expresses this idea, right? That there will not necessarily be reinstitution of karbonot, that it's a higher level is prayer. But that's not the way the Rambam paskind lahalacha, which is a whole topic by itself. But they felt free to make this change, which really, really irritated the Orthodox community. And the reactions to reform are what we'll find very interesting now. You know, there's a klal. The emergence of the other causes others to react to the other. And that's what occurred. So one of the major reactions was a sefer put together, hopefully you can all see this, called Divrei Habrit. This was compiled in 1819, and these were collected letters from rabbinic leaders. And the statement here, I'll translate it, says as follows: to foil a new religion concocted in the hearts of some laymen who are not Torah personalities, to establish their customs not according to the law of Moshe and Israel, published by the Bet Din Tzedek of the Hamburg community. So this included 22 shilas and shuvos from rabbinic leaders in Germany, Hungary, and Poland. It was quite an effort to collect all these, which bring proofs from halachic literature that the alterations are completely usher. Among the Gaonim whose responsa appeared were Rabbi Yaakov of Lisa, who is the author of Nesivos HaMishpat, Prague rabbis, Rabbi Eliezer Flecklash, Rabbi Shmuel Landau, the Chassam Sofer wrote several, the Maram Bennett, Rabbi Kiva Eger, Rabbi Shulam Zalman HaKohen, of Firth, etc. So look at the Isurim. They're very interesting. Hopefully you can all read the words so it's big enough. Number one, Aleph. Asur lishanot seder hatfila hanuhuga b'Yisrael. So I'll translate these. Well, actually, I didn't have the translation. Let's go with it. So it's asur to change the tefillah that is nahug, that is customary b'Yisrael. Min birchot hashachar ad achar aleinu l'shabeach. Umikol shkein she'en ligroa mimenu. Can't change a single tefillah. You can't eliminate any. Second, asur litpalel seder atfila halaz b'lashon acher chutz milashon hakodesh. You can't use any other language for the tefillah. V'chein tefillah hanitveset shelo ketikuna v'shelo keminagenu hi psula v'asur litpalel mitocha. A non-Hebrew prayer is pasul, asur. Last, asur lanagem bebeit hakneset b'shum klei shir b'shabbat u'b'yom tov afilo ayidei ena Yisrael. You see, they nailed exactly on the head what the reformers had done, hiring a non-Jew to play the organ. The Khatam Sofer, interestingly, opposed printing this book because he said, by the very fact that you raise the issue in debate and you collect the dispute and you conduct the dispute with the reformers, it'll strengthen their power and status. But after the fact, he agreed with the necessity to publish it, and he wrote, an anthology of letters from the Gaonim has been printed in Hamburg, and they called it Divrei Abrit, and thank God it's wrought salvation in our land. In 1815, which was a few years before, here you have a picture of Rav Moshe Sofer, the Chassam Sofer. He opposed, as we said, he opposed printing the book. Now in 1815, the Reform had attacked Rabbi Akiva Eger when he was appointed into the rabbinate of Posen with the following attack, quote, he will kill any disposition towards enlightenment and culture, while the number of his Talmud students, augmented on account of him, will contribute to the unsettling of all intelligence, will muddle the senses of the youth, and thwart the true development of their spiritual potential. So you see, it was all-out war between the reformers and the traditional Jews. Now the counter-reaction on the part of the traditional Orthodox Jews was so strong that it led to the creation of what we today call the Haredi group. The Khatam Sofer was the greatest opponent of reform. He was based in Pressburg, Hungary, which is now Bratislava, Slovakia. His students invoked Yehoreg ve'al Yavor against reform initiatives. Imagine, Yehoreg ve'al Yavor, that doing any of the things that the reformers were wanting people to do, whether the vernacular, whether bat mitzvah, whether moving the bima, were Yehoreg ve'al Yavor, the ultimate sacrifice. His son, the Katav Sofer's main student, Rabbi Akiva Yosef Schlesinger, you see here, issued extreme isurim against emulating anything from modern society. He called it all chukat hagoy. As we know, we're not allowed to adopt chukat hagoy. There's a lot of subtlety there, actually, when you study the halacha. But the Hungarian approach was anything that was done by the reformers was chukat hagoy. These ideas flowed strongly into the Carpathian region, Munkach, Satmar, and greatly influenced these Hasidic communities. They opposed the neo-Orthodox leaders that we're going to be talking about in a few moments, who were beginning to arise in Germany and were the source of the militant Orthodoxy that we know today. All of it has its roots in Hungary. All of it has its roots in Hungary. As a siege mentality developed, they rejected even insignificant changes. For example, they insisted on speaking only in Yiddish. They adopted chumras regarding the location of bimas in the shul, the wearing of any clerical robes, the performing of weddings in shuls. Even until the current day, I remember our wedding. I invited my Rabbi, Rav David Lifshitz, Zechron Livracha, to be Masada Kedushin at the wedding. He said to me, where will it take place? And I explained to him in a particular shul. He said, I'm really sorry, I can't go. And this is a vestige of this chumrah, of Chukat HaGoy, about having weddings in a shul, because what the Goyim did in having weddings in churches. Also preaching in the vernacular, creating a mechitza with any small opening. All of these were restricted to provide a united Torah front against innovation. The statement that many of us have heard that the Chassam Sofer used was Hechadash Asur min HaTorah. Anything new is Asur min HaTorah. He originally issued this in respect to one thing, the bima, the position of the bima. But it was expanded by the students. It became the motto of the Haredi rejectionists. It's interesting to note that Rav Moshe in the Tshuva in Or HaChaim 2:41-42 calls this Isur of the bima position unnecessary and a Horat Sha'ah, very liberal position on the part of Rav Moshe. He doesn't insist on it being in the middle of the shul. Now let's move to the other community reaction to reform. So we heard about the Haredi reaction. What emerged was a community that became called Neo-Orthodoxy. Neo-Orthodoxy enabled the preservation of Jewish laws and customs within those communities that were interested in embracing secular society and the modern world. The primary figure and the first and foremost adherent and leader in what became called as Neo-Orthodoxy was Chacham Isaac Bernays. In 1821, he was appointed the Rav of Hamburg. So that was, as you recall, the center of reform as it developed. He was educated at the University of Würzburg. He was dressed in the modern style. As you can see, he's
We lost you, David. The whole thing froze. It's not him, it's the whole thing. System froze.
okay. Sorry, can you hear me? Can you hear me? All right, my computer.
Yes, we can hear you now. We hear
Sorry,
you now.
it's okay. My computer for some reason went away, and I brought it back. So let me just
It's not a nice computer.
let me bring back the share screen. Okay, are we good? Give me a thumbs up. Are we good? Do you see the screen, everybody?
Yeah, we see it.
Moish? Okay. Sorry about that. All right, back to Chacham Isaac Bernays. So he was educated at the University of Würzburg. He dressed in the modern style, and his whole approach was he wanted to meet the reformers on their own turf. He was the first Orthodox rabbi to sermonize in German. He was clean-shaven, relatively clean-shaven, although I see a little bit of something over here, but anyway, relatively clean-shaven, modernized, who could appeal to the acculturated and the young. He signified a new era, and he's believed by historians, therefore, to be the first modern rabbi, fitting the demands of the emancipation. Although he was very traditional in issues of faith, aesthetics, cultural, and civil matters, he was a reformer. He introduced secular studies for children. This is breakthrough stuff. Listen to the list of things he did. He wore a clerical robe like a Protestant clergyman. He delivered frequent German sermons. He forbade the spontaneous, informal, and indecorous character of synagogue conduct that was typical of Ashkenazi tradition. I think some of us can relate to what we're talking about. So he was the first, as we came to call such leaders, neo-Orthodox leaders, combining true Torah learning, greatness in Torah, with secular knowledge. Following him, Rabbi Yaakov Ettlinger came to Altona, which was across the river from Hamburg. He was a world-class Talmid Chacham who studied at the University of Würzburg, opened a yeshiva in Mannheim. He is the Masada, the Sefer Aruch LaNer, which anybody who's learned certainly has heard of the Aruch LaNer. He was a strong opponent of reform. His students included Rav Shamshir Raphael Hirsch and Rav Hildesheimer. Let's start with Rav Shamshir Raphael Hirsch, a very well-known name to all of us. He studied with Rav Ettlinger and Rav Bernays. His university education was at the University of Bonn, received smicha from Rav Bernays, became the Rav of several communities, Oldenburg, Emden, Nikolsburg, and finally Frankfurt in 1851. And there in Frankfurt, he really made his mark. In Frankfurt, the organized Jewish community, and let me step back for a moment. The way things were set up in these countries at that time was every city had an organized Jewish community that was recognized by the government. And their leadership was the recognized leadership. And they were allowed to levy taxes on their community that were recognized by the government. In Frankfurt, Rabbi Hirsch was facing an organized Jewish community that was led by reform. And the number of Orthodox Jews was relatively small. And he pushed back very strongly, took great risks, and he did what was called Ostrit. He led a movement to break away from the organized Jewish community. It was a radical move at that time. And he formed Kahaladat Yeshurun. Over time, he grew it from a handful of families to 500 families. In explaining what he did, he emphasized that it was not that he wanted to disassociate from Jewish individuals, but he wanted to withdraw from a communal system that he viewed as an expression of heresy. And his approach was called Torah im Derech Eretz, combining faithful Torah learning and practice with secular education. And it drew very strong criticism, not only from reform, but also from the Haredi groups. But his approach of Torah Derech Eretz laid the foundation for modern Orthodoxy, particularly as it developed in the United States. And then we come to Rabbi Yosef Breuer and Rabbi Azriel Hildesheimer. Rabbi Yosef Breuer was a grandson of Rabbi Shamshir Raphael Hirsch, who transplanted the community to America. Many of us know the Breuer's community. He was the foundation stone for what they did there. And Rav Azriel Hildesheimer is our next subject. He studied, I'm sorry, I just got confused for a moment. He studied under Rav Ettlinger and Rav Bernays, as well as at the University of Berlin. He majored in Semitic languages and mathematics. In 1851, he became the Rav of Eisenstadt, Hungary, that's now part of Austria, where, interestingly, he founded one of the first primary schools for Jewish children using German and secular subjects, where they taught German and secular subjects. And he also founded a yeshiva there where Talmud and secular courses like languages were taught along with Shulchan Aruch, etc. In 1873, he was invited to Berlin, where he founded the Hildesheimer Rabbinical Seminary, teaching rabbis Torah with secular subjects like philosophy and history. He spurred on his colleagues to take similar positive action, saying, quote, "Always in our midst, there's always no and no and no. The main thing is we need to build." He was followed by Rabbi Chiel Weinberg. Many of us know his famous Sefer, the Srida Eish. He became head of the seminary. He was considered a Torah genius. He learned in Mir and Slobodka. He was a passionate proponent of neo-Orthodoxy, and he had a very strong influence in the pre-war years on none other than Rabbi Yosef Dov Soloveitchik. So if you follow this line, you see how the neo-Orthodox reaction to reform, despite the challenges from reform, and despite the very strong pushback from the Haredi community, created a sturdy and strong foundation for what we have come to know as modern Orthodoxy, which I would argue the Rav is the mainstay and the foundation for modern Orthodoxy, certainly in the United States, starting in the 20th century when he arrived. And so with that, let's transition to the American scene. In the US, there were 5 Jewish communities that were established by Sephardim, namely Jews who came from Spain and Portugal at the very earliest point, once there was a community. There was She'erit Israel in New York City, and this was their original building. Most of us are familiar with She'erit Israel, where it is now, in a very imposing structure further up on the west side. Yeshuat Israel in Newport, Rhode Island. Perhaps many of you have visited the Newport shul. These are the 2 oldest. Yeshuat Israel is in Newport. I'm sorry. Mikveh Israel is in Philadelphia. Their original building doesn't stand. They were moved into a more modern building. Beit Elohim, it's written H-I-M, but I'm going to be from, in Charleston. And Mikveh Israel in Savannah. So you recognize by these names, these are all Sephardic shuls. By the time of the American Revolution, however, most members of these shuls were Ashkenazi. There was no rabbinic leadership in America until well into the 19th century. The first school was established by She'erit Israel in New York in 1775, but it did not last very long. And as we know, Jewish day schools didn't take off in the United States until the 20th century. So Judaism in America was very, very shaky. Where it existed in the shuls, these shuls were run by the laymen. They didn't have the ability to hire rabbanim for a long, long time. Until 1820, there was arguably only one form of Judaism in the United States, namely traditional Judaism. The Jewish population in 1820 totaled less than 5,000 people. Can you imagine? So it's less than the population of Century Village here in Boca, the entire Jewish population. But astonishingly, by 1880, 60 years later, the Jewish population had grown to 250,000, mostly coming from Germany and Central Europe. Inevitably, with these immigrants came reform. And the first Reformed temple, called the Reformed Society of Israelites, was established in Charleston in 1824 after a rejection of a petition at Beit Elohim. You recall, the name of the shul in Charleston was Beit Elohim. Some of their members who were sympathetic to reform filed a petition asking for some changes. These changes were abbreviation of the services, they're too long, selected English prayers, namely, we don't understand all this Hebrew, elimination of auctioning honors, were enough of all these, auctions of all the aliyahs and everything else, and English sermons. We want to hear sermons in the vernacular. So they filed such a petition. It was roundly rejected. And after the rejection of that petition, they broke off and they formed a Reformed temple, the Reformed Society of Israelites. This movement grew. Other Reformed temples were established. And as a matter of fact, by 1880, this is really amazing, over half the shuls in the country were Reformed by 1880. The leader in this movement towards reform is depicted here, the Reverend Isaac Mayer Weiss. Largely due to his efforts, by 1880, there was a Reform seminary, the Hebrew Union. There was a rabbinic organization, the Central Conference of American Rabbis, and there was a synagogue organization, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. In 1883, the HUC, the Hebrew Union, graduated its first class of 4 ordained rabbis. And so you'd say, well, that's great, okay, we don't agree with everything that Reform is saying, but maybe over time they'll see the light, they'll come around, we'll be able to branch out to them. But they really put a nail into the coffin when it came out that the way they celebrated the graduation ceremony was with a flagrantly non-kosher meal that became known later as the Treifa banquet. Take a look at the menu in the Treifa banquet. It started out with little neck clams on the half shell. So it was only half treif. Keep going, crabs, sweetbreads. And to top it off, unless it was a very long banquet, you had ice cream. So unless there were 6 hours worth of speeches, we had a lot of stuff going on here. So obviously this did not make a great impression on the traditional Jewish community. So this is really kind of shocking when you look at it. I mean, it was so in your face to have this, but they were making the point that they saw things differently. They were saying that Judaism is all about tikkun olam, it's all about ethics and morals, and halacha is a thing of the past. At this time, the leader who led the pushback against reform in the United States was Reverend Isaac Leeser. He never got smicha, but he was a very vigorous and very genuine Torah personality in Philadelphia, and he sought to combine Torah knowledge and faithfulness to Torah with embrace of everything that was good in the modern secular environment. Sermons in English were made standard at all services at Mikveh Israel in Philadelphia, and the Bible was translated into English, which was a major, major advance. Now, meantime, Tsarist era pogroms caused a huge swell of immigration from Eastern Europe. So going from 5,000 to 250,000 was pretty impressive. But between 1881 and 1924, almost 3 million Jews came to the United States. This utterly transformed American Jewry. Now think about it. What is going to be happening with these Jews? So there will be a core of these Jews who will try to reconstitute the kind of Jewish life that they left behind in Europe, exactly the way it was. But they're encountering unfamiliar language and culture. And so it took real perseverance to create their own shuls, and they would group around their own locales, right? So you'd have a Polish shul, you'd have a Russisch shul, or even more subdivisions in specific communities where the Jews who came from there formed their own shuls. But the vast majority of the immigrants were unable to be observant, particularly since they had to work on Shabbos to keep their jobs. It was simply no option. They would lose their jobs. And we've heard all these stories about people getting new jobs every week. I mean, come on, guys, it's like a little bit exaggerated. How long can somebody do that? 4 weeks in a row? It was really, really hard for people. And many people, to their great regret, had to work on Shabbos. And that's how the Hashkama Minyan idea started. Many of you may know that people would come early to daven on Shabbos morning and leave because they had to go to work. Rahman al-Islam. As an illustration of how difficult it was to transition from Eastern Europe, many of you recognize Rabbi Eliezer Silver. He immigrated in 1907. He then rose up to become the president of the Agudas HaRabbanim, the president of Agudas Yisrael, the head of the Vad HaHatzalah, a very important Rav and figure in America. When he came to America, he began working for his wife's uncle as a salesman in the garment industry, and later he worked as an insurance salesman. Now, that's pretty striking when you think of who Rabbi Eliezer Silver was, but this was life in America. And one of the results of this tension between wanting to keep things the way they were in Europe versus wanting to become acculturated, become assimilated, become part of American culture, was the rise of the conservative movement. Here you see the Jewish Theological Seminary. It was founded in 1886. And what was it all about? It was founded by moderate traditionalists as a pushback against reform. These were largely Torah Jews who said reform is going too far, but at the same time, we feel that we want to make Jewish life and Jewish law accommodate itself to the new reality of the American society. So that was founded in 1886. It took until 1913 for the conservative movement to fully develop. And finally, our own Yeshiva University had its roots in the Eitz Chaim Yeshiva, founded in 1886, which was the same year as JTS being founded. It was founded initially, Eitz Chaim, on the Lower East Side. It was a Cheder-style elementary school founded by the Eastern European immigrants that offered Talmud along with some secular education, so more in the style of the Neo-Orthodox, and it included instruction in English. And the RIETS, the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary, was chartered in 1897. And so we see the beginnings of the structure of American Jewry being laid down. First, reform as a structure, the reaction to reform being called conservative, because although they were moving far away from Orthodox observance, they were conservative in comparison to reform. And then, of course, what our community, which became to be known as modern Orthodox. And in our next lecture, next week, Mirz Hashem, we will dive into the development of modern Orthodoxy, the challenges that it faced all through the 20th century. Amazingly, we're now in the 21st. So in the third lecture, we'll deal with perhaps what we should call post-modern Orthodoxy and how we're going to go ahead and deal with the issues in the future. So I'll stop sharing now, and I'll open up the chat. We have about 15 minutes. Anybody who would like to call Dichfin, Yesu v'yechol. If you'd rather I unmute, we can do that as well. Okay, everybody can unmute if they would like to ask a question. Go right ahead. Just unmute yourself. Stewie.
David, this is David Barber. I had at the beginning of your talk, did you say that modern Orthodoxy is one of observance rather than belief?
What I meant to bring out was that Judaism is marked mostly by observance. Belief is not at the same level of observance, right? We believe somebody could have doubts. A person is allowed to be asking all kinds of questions. We don't boast about those doubts. We don't try to push them on others. But the main thing is to observe. To go put one foot in front of the other, to put on tefillin, to give tzedakah, to be kind to other people, to learn Torah. Your belief system is your business. That's what I'm maintaining.
Okay, thank you.
Stu, you had a question, Stu?
Yes. Did the reformers ever put forth an argument that they were dating Judaism the way Chazal made changes and instituted him after the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash or Batei Mikdash? Or they simply wanted a different Judaism altogether?
The reform, when you read the early arguments of the reform, you do see some attempts to draw a straight line from certain things that are said in the Nevi'im to their own behaviors and their own beliefs. They rooted themselves more in the Nevi'im than they did in the Gemara. Conservative, I would maintain, had more of an inclination to root themselves in Talmud, in Mishnah and Talmud. However, often it was das yochid. Often it was one opinion that had not been accepted that they used as their basis. But Reform early tried to justify some of their actions, rooting them in what they felt was the spirit of what the Nevi'im were trying to bring out.
You haven't talked about problems in Torah and Mitzvah Judaism, because wasn't Hasidus a reform of the Misnagdim, and do the modern Orthodox come from the Hasidim or the Misnagdim?
It's an interesting point. So unlike the Hasidus that we're familiar with today, one could easily argue that, the facts are that Hasidus was a huge counter-revolution against the kind of Judaism that was prevalent during that time. I think many people would not look at Hasidim today as revolutionaries. They probably say they're very much the traditionalists. But yeah, Hasidus was a huge revolution. To say that modern Orthodox sides with either Hasidim or Misnagdim is a very difficult road to hoe, because on the one hand, many of the ideas of Hasidus, of feeling, of being happy, of not walking around only worrying all the time, hopefully are embraced by the way we believe modern Orthodoxy behaves. But at the same time, our leadership are Litvaks. In many cases, the Litvaks. The Rav was like the Litvak. So he was very much a Misnagid, but he was an interesting Misnagid because he absorbed Hasidus in him from his early teachers.
David, you spoke about the development of the Reform and the conservative acceptance of the modern Orthodoxy. Throughout all this entire period, what role did it wasn't Hasidic, the real traditional Jews, how did they deal with all these changes as they were going along around them? In other words, this was happening while they were still in their place, or whether it's on the east side or Borough Park, etc. did they have any effect at all on what was going on outside?
Okay, are you asking me about Hasidim in America?
In America, I presume most of our community that we're concerned was the one in America. There was always a traditional phase of, that was consistent. It didn't change. The question is, how do they react to all these changes going on around them?
Yeah, so we'll deal with, if it's okay with you, we'll deal with what was going on in America in the next lecture. But I would say that Hasidus in America is very different from Hasidus in Europe.
Yeah, I agree with you.
Have no illusions. The look of the Chassid in Europe, a Radomsker Chassid, a Gera Chassid, was a very different look than what you see today in Borough Park and in other places.
Except not everybody was a chassid in America. We had a frum Jew who was not a chassid. That was the majority of the Jews. The Hasidim didn't come in until 1945.
Of course.
David, I asked you a question in the chat about the beards. You said something about the modern appearance of the German rabbis,
Yeah.
but I know that in Mir Yeshiva, most of the Bechurim didn't wear beards except for the Hasidim.
Right, so that attitude had sunk in. It had become very pervasive. I know that, for example, in some of the Litvish yeshivas, one of the biggest shilas was, how can you shave? They were concerned about using any sort of shaver because it might fall into the category of tar.
They used the powder.
But they did shave.
They
Wait,
used
wait.
powder.
So they used to use this depilatory cream or powder.
I mean, if you look at the picture, the standard picture of the Mir Yeshiva in Shanghai, maybe 1/10 of the people, and maybe less than that, had beards.
But not only in Shanghai, even in America.
I'm just giving you an example.
Right, but in America, most people, when I was younger, when we started our shul, Rabbi Weim, for instance, was not wearing a beard. Most of the Rabbanim were not wearing beards. That became a much more pronounced style, I would say, probably about 40 years ago when they started growing beards. But most people did not wear beards here in America.
Yeah.
Question.
Certainly true. You look at pictures of wedding celebrations where Moshe and his wife are sitting at the same table along with other couples.
At my wedding, they were sitting together.
Okay. These are things that you won't find in art scroll picture books, but they did happen.
Okay, question.
Yes.
You saw the early Reform temples in Germany, where they hired a goy to play the organ. And so they tried to keep to tradition. It seems to be a big step from that, even though it wasn't traditional to have music, except going back to the Beit HaMikdash, to have an actual tray for dinner. So
it was a big step. It was a huge step. And I think it shows that initially they tried to be accommodationist. They tried to make themselves palatable to the traditional community. And when the pushback was so incredibly strong, as we spoke about earlier, that it became called Yehorig Val Yavor, that it's completely usher, that every minhag is like Torah, they just said, the heck with it. Why bother? We don't really believe that ourselves. We were just doing it in order to be able to get along. I think that's the reality. Any other questions? These are wonderful questions, please. I think we have something in the chat. Okay, that was Tammy. George Adler says he recalls in the early 70s at the Chavetz Chaim Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, the Bukhrim were not allowed to grow beards. Rav Heinach allowed me to keep mine only because I had it. My goodness. Why would they not allow beards?
It's strange.
That's very
strange.
Okay.
I also had one little comment about JTS, that originally, I think their goal was to be like a yeshiva university, like their whole staff were Orthodox people.
That is
And
correct. That is
years
correct.
later, things changed, but originally, I think they felt that they were beginning a yeshiva university.
In fact, they had a mechitza in their shul and theological seminary. Not only that, when I went to Columbia, I used to eat my dinners over there. So
I used to eat dinner there every night at Barnard.
It was a
Me too.
completely different philosophy of those days than it is today.
Yes, yes. Many of us remember, I see friends of mine from Israel who will also nod and remember that we ate dinner there.
That's it. It was not bad.
One of our friends had a great mishap. I'm sure our friends in Israel remember this story. One of our friends walked into, he didn't know the area very well, so he walked into a building that said seminary, and he went into the dining room and he figured he would have a nice meal. So he ordered a steak.
Okay.
And he sat down, and something about the room bothered him, as I recall the story goes. Something about the room. He looked around, and he saw these sort of interesting icons all around the room. And he said to somebody, isn't this the Jewish Theological Seminary? He said, no, it's Union Seminary. So there was a risk, but you're right. In the next lecture, talk about the incredible rivalry between the modern Orthodox and the conservative movements that really played a very big role in the pushback by modern Orthodox in many, many aspects through the 50s. It was not at all clear who was going to win in America. It was not at all clear. So thank you, Tammy. That's a very important point that'll take us into the next lecture.
I recall in the early 60s, when I was at Columbia, I would eat at the seminary, and sometimes I went there Shabbos. And down in the basement, they had the big minyan. There was no mechitza, but the men were on one side, the women were on the other side, and they used the Phillips prayer book.
Okay, yeah, but the main shul, I recall, had a permanent mechitza in it.
Yes, the main shul had a mechitza. I remember that too.
Right, right.
Sure.
Any other thoughts? Yeah? Rabbi Kranzler, you had something else you wanted to say?
No, I just wanted to give you a big